Good morning. It's really wonderful to be here at the Paris Peace Forum, which brings together individuals, as we just saw, from all across the world to work on some of our hardest problems. So it's truly terrific to be here, and a tremendous thank you to our French hosts. Ransomware has become a problem affecting countries around the world, and it's a classic transnational problem. You have attackers who are sitting in one or two countries using network infrastructure that could be sitting in 6, 7, 8, 10 countries, attacking a hospital or a school in any number of other countries. There were 4,400 ransomware attacks from January 2021 to July of 2022, affecting all sectors of our economies, including the most vulnerable. I mentioned hospitals in France and the United States and Ireland, schools in multiple countries, companies, energy companies specifically. In addition to the disruptive and destructive impact of ransomware, in many cases, companies or entities choose to pay the ransom, and the US Treasury estimates almost $1 billion in ransoms were paid in 2021 alone. So the idea that disruptive cyber attacks not only have an economic impact from withholding services, but also enforcing payments is incredibly troubling. Because it is such an international problem, it takes international partnership between countries, between government and the private sector and civil society to actually address it. So a year ago, the United States brought together 36 countries in the European Union as partners, true partners in tackling the problem. And we chose to tackle it as a group of countries by standing up 5 focused efforts led by countries from around the world. We recently had our annual first meeting that looked at the work that was accomplished in the first year, invited the private sector to join with 13 multinational companies giving perspective on the problem, and formed the plans for the coming year. So in today's session, I'll briefly outline the Counter-Ransomware Initiative and then invite the individuals who led those working groups from around the world to talk about the work, describe the plan moving forward, and then we look forward to hearing your questions as well. So I mentioned that ransomware truly is an international problem with multiple aspects to be addressed. The first is resilience. How do we secure our systems to make them less likely to be successfully attacked and ransomed? That panel was co-led by General Rajesh Pant of India and Margiris Abukevičius, the Deputy Minister of Defense of Lithuania. There's a really powerful partnership there. India, a very large country, Lithuania, far smaller, brought together by looking at how large and small countries take on the problem of resilience. And you see Rajesh and his team on the screen. The second panel, countering illicit cryptocurrency. Clearly, ransomware is driven by criminals' desire for money. So tackling cryptocurrency and the movement across borders to ensure that it could be used for positive things, but we can counter the illicit use, was a core priority. That effort was led by Singapore and the United Kingdom. And we have the Home Secretary of the United Kingdom who co-led that effort, Chloe Squires, who's joining us virtually as well. The third part of the effort was public-private partnership, led by Spain, and Guillermo will speak to that shortly. The fourth, of course, diplomacy, because in many cases, as we look to international cyber norms exist, including the norm against harboring criminal actors who are disrupting, first, harboring actors, and second, disrupting critical infrastructure. So that diplomacy working group was led by Regine Greenberger, and with a focus on multi-stakeholder engagement. And indeed, Regine will note her new partner as we work moving forward. So those were the core working groups, and I left off the fifth, very significant one, which is disruption. How do we disrupt criminals? How do we disrupt networks? How do we make it harder, riskier, and more costly for them to operate? And that work was led by Australia, and specifically Michael Puzzulo, the Home Secretary of Australia. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panelists and invite each of them to offer a few moments of opening remarks. So I'll begin with Rajesh Pant, who co-led the panel on resilience, joining us from India. Rajesh, over to you. Rajesh, we can't hear you. There has to be one of those moments in every remote effort. Okay. So while Rajesh works to figure out how we address this, and the team here, I'll turn it over to Ambassador Regina Greenberger to talk about the diplomacy working group and the work done to address the diplomatic angle of the ransomware cyber attack problem.
Thank you, Anne. Well, first, I remember when we started this initiative that the two of us were having a discussion about is a specific diplomacy track really necessary, or isn't the initiative itself already enough, diplomacy, there is enough diplomacy in it that we wouldn't need an extra working group on that. But then we decided to have a separate diplomacy track, also to give all the diplomats in our group a home where they would be able to contribute. It's true that the Counter-Ransomware Initiative itself is based on international cooperation, and we noted that all of the participating countries are nationally under a huge pressure at the moment from ransomware attackers. When we compared notes, we found that we have a lot in common, although the group is quite diverse. We have countries like the US and Australia and the UK. We have also some European countries and the European Union itself. But we have also partners from the Global South. Okay, another technical issue.
Can you hear me now, please?
We could, so give us a moment and Regina will finish her remarks, Rajesh, and we'll come back to you.
And when comparing notes, we also found that both governments and law enforcement practitioners find this international cooperation not only useful, but even necessary. So this is the basic motivation for the group. The group itself is open and remains open for countries who want and can work with each other to combat ransomware. The composition, as I said, is very diverse, also in terms of how diverse the delegations are, so different backgrounds and approaches come together to solve this problem. One thing that we have in common is our willingness to engage in combating ransomware and exploring also new ways to do so. The latest addition to our group is Belgium, and now we are 37, 36 plus the EU. And I have also a new co-chair for the diplomacy track, which is Nigeria. Nigeria is very active, also, for example, in New York when negotiating global norms for cyber. And I'm very happy to work with my new colleague there. A second thought that I would like to share with you. This group decided to make use also of multilateral fora like today, the Paris Peace Forum, where we kind of show and tell what we actually do and want to do. In these multilateral fora, we want to highlight the need to raise also political awareness for the issue of ransomware. Because for us, it's clear, it's not only technical cooperation that we need also to strengthen the political will all over the place. Political will means more resources, better structures. We use also regulation, we will come to that when we talk about finance, and we address the issue of accountability. What do I mean with this? Ransomware is, of course, a cybercrime phenomenon, first of all, but ransomware actors are organized in criminal organizations, and many of them find shelter in non-cooperative jurisdictions. So the Counter-Ransomware Initiative also decided to hold them accountable and put pressure on those who provide safe harbors for them. And the best thing to do this is doing it together, because this is basically something that none of us can do alone. Then my impression is that the Counter-Ransomware Initiative is also kind of a concrete, real-time lab for cooperation, and something that mirrors the more abstract global framework that is forged at the moment in Vienna and New York, where we talk about a global convention on cybercrime, or a cybercrime treaty. This is done within an ad hoc committee on cybercrime, and the first year of negotiation is now over. We made some progress. We still have something to do. And whereas some members of the Counter-Ransomware Initiative already can use the Budapest Convention, this is also a convention to combat cybercrime, but only a regional cooperation. Some of us can use it as the basis for our cooperation, but not all of us have ratified the Budapest Convention. So the global treaty will be, for the first time, a basis for all of us, a first-time legal framework for all of us. Why is this so important? The global treaty will have provisions that will be relevant also for combating ransomware and make our cooperation even more effective and fast. A third thought I would like to share with you: to be effective in our joint combat against ransomware, we have to rely also on a good legal framework, but also on capacities and capabilities of us as partners. So capacity building is the issue that I would like to address now. We had in our diplomacy group already an exchange with some experienced capacity builders like Interpol, and we will certainly identify next year, you were asking about what are we going to do, identify some projects that are relevant for the group in its entirety. So that's one of our plans, what we want to do next year.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Greenberger. And later, Regine can talk a bit about why the diplomacy discussion at the Counter-Ransomware Summit this year was one of the most provocative in terms of a discussion around attribution. So we'll do that when we get to the Q&A part. So there is a role for diplomacy. It's a challenging one, given some of the aspects we'll talk about. But let's turn it now back, since it looks like General Pant was able to connect. Let's turn it back to India to talk a bit about resilience and two specific outcomes which the Resilience Working Group worked on, both exercises around the world, as well as the stand-up of a new capability to offer countries in terms of tracking malware and the ways to mitigate it. So Rajesh, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Please confirm if I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay, greetings of the day to all attendees of the Paris Peace Forum. I wish I could be there personally in your beautiful city, but constraints of time in office. So, as Anne was mentioning, ransomware is today probably the most serious cybercrime in the cyberspace. And we find that the criminals have got together and they are offering ransomware as a service. So you have the access broker, you have the cryptographer, you have the financial expert and the exfiltrator, etc. They are all offering it as a service. So the only way to counter this menace is for like-minded nations to join hands and create this sort of a coalition. And the credit goes to Deputy NSA and Neuberger for taking this initiative and bringing 36 countries and the EU together in this forum. So as part of the CRI, as was mentioned, there are 5 verticals, and India and Lithuania, as a colleague, were leading the vertical on resilience. Now, resilience, as some of you may be aware, is a proactive action. Why should we always react after the incident has taken place? We have to prevent the incident from taking place. So that is what resilience implies. that in the face of attacks, how do you protect your networks? So in the resilience working group, we had 22 member nations, and we had 4 lines of effort. The first was tools, tactics, and procedures. So the aim was that we will get the TTPs from all these 22 nations and compile a sort of a threat digest and distribute these best practices to all the member states. The second was a ransomware threat information sharing cell, which was a lead that Lithuania has taken because they have a response center available with them. And through that, we are creating a sort of a network with which we will be sharing all the information of the indicators of compromise of ransomware. These 2 lines of effort were led by Lithuania. India led the other 2 lines of effort. The first of them was past incidents. That means we create a sort of a repository of all the incidents of ransomware which are taking place, and then we try and find out what is the trend, and then give out an advisory as to how to take preventive measures. And the fourth pillar was capacity building and conduct of cyber exercises. And this was a very successful action that we did for all the 36 nations and the EU. So because of the time difference, we divided into 2 parts. We had an Eastern Zone exercise with the help of Singapore Cybersecurity Agency. And then we have a Western Zone exercise with the help of the UK government and BAE systems. So one was on the energy sector and the other one was on the finance sector. And both these exercises came out with very good lessons learned for everyone. So having done this past 1 year's exercise, we also prepared a non-paper as to what would be the future action of this initiative. And maybe Anne will speak of that future action subsequently. But we created a base diagram as to what sort of an organization can now take this forward in terms of creation of a task force, etc. In addition, finally, we also presented a repository of malware that India has created called Malware Kosh. And this presentation was also given to all the CRI nations as to how they can take advantage of the 110 million samples that we have got, including all the ransomware families, and quickly get to know as to what would be the impact of that ransomware. That is the work of Resilience Group. Thank you very much, and it's back to you, Anne.
So the combination of both rolling out ways to share malware and learn best techniques to defend against it, exercises carried out, as you said, splitting the world in 2 because of all the time zones, and discussions of how to build resilience, particularly for the sectors we're most concerned about. So really, really powerful work. I talked a bit about how much money drives the ransomware problem. It's a fascinating chart when you look at the rise of ransomware. As the price of Bitcoin went up, the rise of ransomware went along with it. So really interesting there. Now, as folks know, the cryptocurrency infrastructure around the world is a complex one. And not only have we seen hacks, not only have we seen the illicit movement of money fuel ransomware, but we've also seen hacks of cryptocurrency infrastructure conducted by the DPRK, by the North Koreans, fueling their missile program. So there's been a lot of work thinking about how do we ensure cryptocurrency can be used for the positive uses. Labor remittances, individuals working in one country who want to send home money quickly and cheaply, but not for the illicit movement of funds driving, whether it's cyber hacks, whether it's trafficking in people or weapons. That panel was led by Singapore and the UK, and we have Chloe Squires here, who is Director General for Homeland Security of the UK, joining us virtually to talk a bit about that work, the work to progress implementing Know Your Customer rules, and really taking on illicit use of crypto. Chloe, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Just to check that everyone can...
We can hear you, but you're a little low. If we can raise the volume. Keep going.
Okay, I'll keep going and I'll speak up. And
Perfect.
First of all, I wanted to say it's a huge pleasure to be able to join you this morning for this discussion. And secondly, to pay tribute to Anne and her team in the US for convening what has been, I think, an incredibly important initiative over the last year to counter ransomware, culminating in a really tremendous summit last week. And it's great to be able to sort of talk about that today. And I think as you'll hear, we've done a lot in the first year, but there's clearly a lot more that we need to do collectively and hopefully with the support and input of some of the people here today as well as we venture into this world in year 2. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the countering illicit finance strand, and I thought it might just be worth pausing at the beginning on why we think that's so important, and Anne touched on this just now. And clearly there's part of this which is about the use that we can make of tracking of crypto assets to understand perpetrators, but actually to the point that Lieutenant General Pant just made, it's also crucial for our ability to prevent ransomware attacks and to sort of what we hope will be undermine the business model. So for us and Singapore as conveners of this strand, you know, we sort of went back to the problem space here, and as we all know, for many of the ransomware criminals, if not all, there is an element of financial gain, if not financial gain being the main motivation for what they're doing. So if we can more effectively tackle that business model through our work on illicit finance, then we potentially raise the cost to them and deter future activity, which would hopefully define the future trajectory of this really important and really serious crime that we're all facing. But what we do know, as Anne said, is that our approaches to this internationally are somewhat piecemeal. They're very inconsistent across different jurisdictions, and frankly, illicit criminals in illicit finance doesn't respect international boundaries, and they will make use of those differences between jurisdictions to sort of counter what we're trying to achieve. So what we looked at through this working group, and I would like to sort of say a huge thank you to all of the participants who brought a huge amount of their learning and experience to this over the last year, was to try and understand how we could collectively improve the policy response and achieve a greater level of coherence and consistency internationally in our policy response, with a view to removing some of those barriers across jurisdictions and achieving a single common approach, even if that is manifested slightly differently in different countries. So one of the first things we did was look at what we are all doing in our different jurisdictions, because we've all been, as Anne said at the beginning, trying to tackle this in our own countries, but we all know that we can't do this individually. And everybody has quite different experiences of what they've done to date and are at different stages in that journey. And so there's a huge amount that we can learn from each other about what's worked and what hasn't to date. And I think we looked at a couple of things over the first year. So we looked at how we can use analytical tools to monitor the blockchain, how different countries are approaching the supervision of virtual asset service providers, and crucially, how different countries are approaching payment of ransoms, because there are quite a lot of different policy approaches to that, which we can learn from at the moment. And we've brought all of this together into a report at the end of the first year, which both summarises what we've learned, but also suggests some of the areas to go further. And to give you a sort of very brief kind of synopsis of what we found there, because I think that's important for where we go in year 2. It's found that actually there's quite a common challenge in understanding both the evidence base and the scale of the challenge. We can all talk about particular incidents, but we all, I think, know that in our individual countries, ransomware incidents are underreported. So it's very difficult to gain a really true sense of how impactful this is across a nation, let alone internationally. So what we did, though, was find some of the areas where we could see people had been driving forward work, or where there were opportunities to do more and achieve a more consistent approach. And to run through some of those briefly, so we looked at how we might be able to standardise reporting, both domestically and internationally. That doesn't mean having one repository somewhere, but it does mean understanding where our thresholds are and how they may be similar or different. Encouraging how we can make reporting as fast as possible. And different countries have approached this in different ways, some by making it mandatory or mandatory above certain thresholds. Others haven't gone down that route. We haven't yet here. And there's something interesting there about how that then drives different behaviours and our ability to therefore respond. Join up, and this has been touched on already, both internationally but also across sectors. How can we improve information sharing, make sure that we're doing that as quickly as possible when incidents happen, but also learning from those incidents and being honest about what has happened to the extent that we can, and then so that we can then build on that experience collectively. Looking at join up across different organisations within countries as well as internationally, and I think the UK will not be alone here in saying that tackling something as complex as ransomware brings in very different parts of a government system. So everything from law enforcement to I sit in the Home Department, but crucially our Treasury, our financial department and the private sector, and making sure that we actually have the connectivity internally as well as internationally to be able to understand the problem and tackle it. We're looking at how we can pull some of this into a better online guide, which also helps reporting so that people can look at both for advice but also can move to reporting very rapidly. And I think a big theme for this year, and which we've touched on, but also into year 2, is how we can work better with different sectors, including industry, and I think that was a big theme. Now, Regine, earlier in her remarks, I think touched on the importance of legislation, and I didn't want to kind of finish without mentioning that. So, in the UK, we've been working with our Financial Conduct Authority and our Financial Department of Treasury to try and improve the legislative framework that we have here. So we've got a bill in our Parliament at the moment, which is trying to do that and improve our ability to track and seize crypto assets and to improve information sharing. But as we talked about at the summit last week, we think the Financial Action Task Force on anti-money laundering are absolutely crucial here, and that's been a big theme of the work that Singapore and we have led over the last year and the contributions from other countries. And we know the application of that is inconsistent internationally, and we also know that applying those sort of regimes takes upfront investment in time and effort and resource. But I think one of the core themes that's come through over the last year has been the importance of moving forward with that implementation in different jurisdictions so that we can achieve a greater baseline of commonality in legislative terms internationally. And that's something I'm sure will continue to be a theme as we go into the second year of this programme. So just briefly then to touch on the second year, and Singapore and the UK are absolutely committed to continuing to lead on this strand, and it's going to broaden into a wider kind of policy approach, but with illicit finance being a continued core of that as we look at how we can achieve greater commonality of approach and more than the sum of our parts effort internationally. So some of the particular themes we want to pick up looking at year 2 are barriers to data sharing, and that's, as I said, between organisations and internationally. The role of insurance in the sector, which we've touched on in year 1, but we haven't had time to fully explore, and I think there are, as we know, different thoughts and different approaches to that, which we want to look at, but potential for that to be quite significant. And then options for how we improve reporting. And I think really learning from those countries, and some of them represented here today, who have gone further in mandatory reporting than others have, and looking at where and how we might be able to learn from that experience collectively. So I'm very happy to unpack and talk more about that in questions later on, but I'll pause there because there's quite a lot there, and just finish on the point that I think Anne made and others have made in all of the remarks, which is this is and has to be a collective international effort. And that's not just limited to governments, it's absolutely about the private sector, about the third sector, and about sort of law enforcement partners in all forms. So this is something that we have to tackle together, and we're really looking forward to doing that further in year 2 of this initiative. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Chloe. So Chloe highlighted, I'll pick up 2 parts that we'll come back to in a question for her. One is tackling the moral hazard challenge, right? For any given entity whose data or systems are ransomed, and we've seen a current ransom attack going on in Australia against a large insurance company where very sensitive data regarding a vulnerable population is reputed to be leaked. For any given entity, paying the ransom may feel like it is the best approach. Overall, that fuels increasingly destructive attacks. So countries coming together to discuss that moral hazard and whether there should be policies banning payments is exactly the kind of effort there. And then Chloe also highlighted a public-private aspect of insurance, which she'll talk more about. Each of us in our homes probably have, in order to buy a home, one needs to install smoke detectors, right, in order to get home insurance. Car insurance incentivizes safer driving of cars. So cyber insurance could incentivize the best practices that could make it far harder to attack a network. Thinking about how governments coordinate with insurance companies in a coordinated way of what those policies should be is a classic example of a multi-stakeholder approach to take on this hard problem. So we'll ask Chloe to talk a bit about that more later. So I want to come to the third working group, which was the disruption working group. How do we disrupt criminals? How do we disrupt the network infrastructure and make it riskier, costlier, and harder for them to conduct attacks? That takes global law enforcement partnership. And Australia led that group, and we have Mark Ablong here of the Department of Home Affairs to talk a bit more about the disruption working group, the work it did, and we'll talk just a hint of what will be coming, but we'll pick up on that a bit more later. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Anne, and very pleased to be with you all, though very disappointed not to be there in person. As everybody has said so far, and I think is common knowledge these days, ransomware is both a global scourge and a transnational crime. Defeating that requires coordinated international action, and everybody has said that so far. While we recognised in the Disruption Working Group that there have been some successes over recent years, the explosion of ransomware and the threat we face means that we can't just keep doing what we have done before. So during the course of this year, we've spent a lot of time going through the various case studies of where ransomware attacks have hit a particular jurisdiction and the means and mechanisms that law enforcement operating with their compatriots at a national level and at an international level have been successful in dealing with the threat or managing the consequences after the threat has actually been activated. We thought, as the Disruption Group, that it made sense for national authorities to be able to work easier together, to share their knowledge so that multiple jurisdictions can act in the common defence of us all. So effectively what we've been doing over the last year is building a toolkit for investigators of the types of issues that both Rajesh and Chloe have been speaking about, the tools and techniques that the ransomware criminal actors use, as well as the tools and techniques that are necessary for investigators in the law enforcement community and elsewhere to be able to respond. As has been said by everybody so far, sharing information, whether that be threat intelligence or phenomenology or tools, techniques and procedures, is fundamental if we're going to tackle this problem very, very well. Decided at the end of the year's work, and as you said, and we'll talk a little bit more about it going forward, that there was a need for an international counter-ransomware task force where we could bring all of those actions together and provide a more robust set of tools that covered all of the sectors that have been talking about in terms of resilience, countering illicit financing and disruption activities, threat intelligence exchanges and the like, to increase our early warning capabilities to help countries to prevent attacks as well as to disrupt those attacks when they occur. Effectively, what we're doing is consolidating both policy frameworks and best practice activities by law enforcement communities. We will try and make those reports, those tools, those techniques available to anybody who wants to sign on and to build a model not just for collaboration at the country level, but also with private sector partners. So in essence, we want to be able to use and leverage the breadth of authorities and tools across the membership of the task force to ensure that we're making it harder for ransomware actors to operate. We recognise that some countries will have greater legal authorities to be able to operate in particular ways to disrupt the threat actors than other countries will. And it's about how do we join both those who have the capability and the capacity to support those who might be less well able to do so. By working together, we can take advantage of the collective capabilities we can field to improve the way in which we operate together, but also to make it a harder environment for the ransomware actors and effectively stop them in their tracks. I might stop there, Anne, and we can unpack some of that during the question time.
Thank you so much, Mark. So it's really fitting that we come finally, as the most significantly, to the discussion on public-private partnership. That's why we're here. The Paris Peace Forum talks about bringing together public and private sectors and civil society groups to tackle truly hard problems. And each of our governments have talked about their efforts to work with the private sector, some of the challenges of that, some of the progress made, learning from each other in terms of legal frameworks, of and frankly, openness on culture change and how to work with the private sector. So Guillermo Fernandez Lopez of Spain led the public-private working group that sought to pull together the best lessons from around the world on that. So Guillermo, if you can talk a bit about that panel, it would be great to hear from you.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Good morning. Bonjour à tous. I think the previous question was how to pass from the vicious circle to the righteous one. And I'd like to begin defining a vicious circle as a chain of events in which the response to one difficulty creates a new problem that aggravates the initial one. It came to my mind two concepts that could fit the very nature of ransomware. One was the VUCA environment, this acronym that was created in the 90s by the US Army War College to describe a turbulent and rapidly changing environment with the characteristic of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And also the weak problems, which is a problem difficult to solve due to its complex, unpredictable, open-ended, or intractable nature. But this kind of weak problem, like we can define ransomware, can be harnessed through multi-stakeholder partnerships. And this is the starting point of this righteous circle with global initiatives such as the Counter-Ransomware Initiative and the Paris Peace Forum as appropriate ways of solution through the promotion of multilateralism, acting globally in a comprehensive way and tackling all the facets from a problem-solving perspective to counter ransomware as done by the 5 working groups of the CRA, such as the public-private partnership, resilience, counter illicit finance, diplomacy, and disruption. Following the works of the first summit of the CRI, we can several documents and conclusions were proposed and a clear next step road was developed. As you know, the CRI was initially structured in 4 working groups, but given the importance of the public-private partnership, it was decided the creation of a 5th working group. This is the public-private partnership that Spain has the honor and responsibility to coordinate this one. And this is coordinated through the Cyber Coordination Office of the Ministry of Interior. Maybe this could be because the existence in Spain of a successful model of P3, it was the Spanish National Cybersecurity Forum. It was constituted, its constitution took place in July 2002 as a place to integrate representatives of civil society, independent expert, private sector, academia, association, non-profit organization, among others, in order to enhance and create public-private synergies. The working dynamic of our group was focused on the holding of working meetings, and we proposed initially 3 goals. The first one was the compilation of best practices. The other one was a creation on a centralized database to share information and intelligence to counter ransomware. And the last one was the creation of a network of experts, both private and public. These ideas were presented in this last summit and were very similar to those who had well finally agreed, like the establishment of the Counter-Ransomware Task Force and the creation of the Fusion Cell. Also, during the summit, we announced of a new ransomware capacity building tool, a joint project with the United States and Spain that will feature a series of case studies of P3, and it will be commissioned through the Global Forum of Cyber Expertise to deliver this tool. During the works of the working group, we presented several case studies of best practices in public-private partnerships around the world. One of them was the Spanish National Cybersecurity Forum. This is comprised of 5 working groups. The first of this one, it was about cybersecurity culture, with the main takeaway of evolving from awareness to commitment, The second one, it was aimed to boost research, development, and innovation to increase public-private cooperation. The third one, for education, training, and talent to promote cybersecurity training in line with market demands. Another one of cyber defense industry. And the last one about regulation to systematize public-private cooperation in regulatory matters.
Guillermo, I think we have like another 60 seconds because we have to open it up to questions.
Perfect.
Thank you. Is there anything you wanted to finish, Guillermo? Or
Only for finish to say that P3 combines the best of the both worlds, public and private. Private sector can afford a lot of high capacity of innovation and capabilities to elaborate cyber intelligence. And the public sector, the main asset for us is the legal authority to establish regulatory frameworks and the mandate of protection of the public interest and the maintenance of the rule of law also in the cyberspace domain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guillermo. This was a really important working group. So with that, let's open it up to any questions from the audience. Sure.
Chris Painter.
They have a mic for you, Chris.
Oh, sorry. Chris Painter, I'm the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, so happy to work with you on that initiative. And I also wanted to say how good I thought the communique that you issued at the end of that international meeting was, particularly its reference to capacity building, which I think is important. I have a separate question on the role of insurance. Recently, I was speaking at a Lloyd's of London event, and they have issued guidance that they're not going to cover, for instance, nation-state activity. When you talked about insurance, what's the way forward in the ransomware task force, the International Ransomware Task Force, to take this issue? Many people thought insurance would be a way to drive better cyber hygiene, and that hasn't happened yet. So how does that play in with your efforts?
It's a fantastic question because one of the hardest problems in cybersecurity is how do you incentivize companies, governments, all organizations to do the kinds of practices that make them harder targets, right? To lock the equivalent of their physical doors, put on an alarm system, which many still don't do. If you look at classic, cybersecurity reports of cyber attacks, they still cite the same unpatched systems and common vulnerabilities that make it too easy for attackers to be successful. So I'll turn it to Chloe in a moment, but essentially, one of the policy areas that the Counter-Ransomware Initiative will be taking on is taking different countries. That's really been the power of taking different countries' approaches, pulling that in and saying, what have we learned communally? And then where do we go from here? And I think certainly the outline looks like in at least some countries, they've put in place requirements for insurance companies to require certain practices in order to make payments or potentially to ban insurance companies from paying the ransoms. They can, as one member said at the working group, there's good insurance and bad insurance. Bad insurance may be one that reimburses for ransoms. Good insurance may be one where if a company or entity has done the right practices, it could provide reimbursement for the recovery work they still need to do. But I'll turn it over to Chloe to see what she would like to add on that point, noting the work is only kicking off now, but we've noted it as a key topic. Chloe?
Thank you, Anne, and thanks to Chris for the great question. And as Anne said, it's a topic we've started discussing as part of the kind of policy work in year one, but it's very much a theme we want to come back to in year two. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. Partly because I think there are mixed views, in all honesty, about where we're at and the role that insurance can play. And as Anne said, there's a sort of good and bad role there. So I think we've all got experience of where insurance in other areas or in other threat areas that we face can play a really important role in raising standards and building resilience in different sectors and across sectors. And I think that's where we think there is huge potential for insurance to play a role. And then there's obviously a question about how we make sure that is according to kind of internationally recognised standards and there is some degree of coherence so that we're not creating different kind of models in different jurisdictions. There is also, though, concern that in some areas it could be seen as an easy way of paying ransoms. and therefore fueling the problem that we're all trying to tackle. So it's a really we had a really interesting but non-conclusive first discussion of this as part of year one, and we have picked it up as a theme for year two, and we'd be really keen to have input from Chris and others and who feel they can contribute here. We know there are good examples internationally, and sort of where people are seeing the evidence of work to date. But we also know that there are a lot of countries, including our own, where we haven't actually taken a standard approach yet.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Other questions from the audience? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so the question is more to the resiliency group on sharing IOCs. So my question is to who was the receiver of the IOCs? Was it the national CERTs, or was it some organization which was composing nation CERTs, private sector, and how the private sector could have been informed that they can actually maybe join this activity as well?
General Pant, do you want to take that one? Okay, it looks like we may not have our Indian colleagues. And that is a topic they are passionate about. So we're going to take another question and try. Now we do.
I'm here. General Pant has been called by the deputy, so I'm here. I may know the question once again. Sorry for this kind of thing.
No problem. The question was, when we talked about indicator of compromise sharing, who were the recipients? So you might talk about the Regional Cyber Defense Center work in Lithuania and your work on distributing and sharing IOCs, but over to you.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. The plan was, when we were working for the last 1 year, we found that the intel sharing is a very important aspect of what we are doing together as 37 member states. And we worked out that we need to have a MISP instance at one place, wherein we have the contributing nations contributing the various IOCs and TTPs. They get consolidated, aggregated, and then we make threat intel out of it, and the same is distributed through the MISP platforms, wherein we have a instance being run by the RCDS of Lithuania, and at this and we have the clients at each of the member states, or whosoever want to join as per the processes and protocols. Apart from that, we also offer from the Indian side a ransomware analysis platform and repository, wherein the samples could be shared, and at this platform we generate the IOCs and the TTPs, and thereafter aggregate them, and then share the detailed alerts, advisories, and reports to all the member nations who are participating in this. The aim was to also get to aggregate various decryptors as collected from the member state, as also from the open source, and to have a kind of library there, which helps our partner nations as also the private sector in handling any of those incidents. So that was in a nutshell what we have thought about, but any more contribution or any more suggestions on this are most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think there was a question here on this side.
Thank you very much, Anne, and everybody. Craig Jones, I'm the Director of Cybercrime at Interpol. We've been in the margins. Sorry?
We need you up here.
Well, that's my offer. We've been involved in the margins of this for the last year on the illicit finance group. Interpol has 195 member countries. The aim of the programme is to reduce the global impact of cybercrime and protect communities for a safer world. I feel we could add quite a lot of value on a number of points, but One in particular is the public-private partnerships and information sharing. We're able to share police data with 195 countries, but also we have agreements with private partners as well. And these are standardized agreements which we have negotiated over a long period of time. So I'm looking forward in the future to being part of the initiative in whatever way we can. Thank you.
Super, thank you so much. And Mark Ablong of Australia. Australia is leading, as he talked about, the Joint Ransomware Task Force, because our goal is really using information shared to disrupt. And that's the culture change we're seeking to drive, and I know that he will welcome that offer. Thank you. Mark, any comments you wanted to make?
No, thanks, Anne, and we absolutely want Interpol to be a key part, along with industry participants, many of whom are seeing things that governments can't. So it's about bringing all of those players together, and we very much welcome the opportunity to work with Interpol on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sure.
Related to Interpol, we had a presentation of the Fusion Center of Interpol located in Singapore as a part of the Interpol Global Complex for Innovation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guillermo. So no further questions here. I'll ask Regina the question we talked about a moment earlier, which was the most provocative discussion of the 2 days of the Counter-Ransomware meeting was a debate regarding attribution. So Regina, perhaps you summarize that quickly and your takeaways from that.
Yeah, this was really a remarkable discussions where two worlds met. The world of the, the cybercrime combating practitioners and the world of diplomacy. And the controversy is basically about attribution. Attribution means naming nation-state actors that are responsible for malicious cyber activities. And in this case, we see that some nation-states provide safe harbors for ransomware criminal organizations, and therefore should be held accountable also as states. And then there is an additional a thought or perception that is that the lines between, this is clearly cybercrime and this is hybrid threat, perhaps also in the context of a war, these lines are continuously blurred. We can't sometimes decide clearly, okay, this is just cybercrime, or this is actually already a malicious state actor activity. So attribution is a very critical element, and what one has to know is also that there is a global framework describing what responsible attribution is, but there is also a national prerogative to use this tool in the diplomatic field. And there are some states, Germany, US, that have national procedures of how to do attributions, but there are also others who don't have a national procedure or are generally reluctant to use this tool. The argument of those who do not want to focus on attribution in the context of the Counter-Ransomware Initiative is that this effort, it's time and energy consuming. It would perhaps dilute our efforts in the practical field of combating ransomware. And the focus should be on prosecution and on disruption. And this doesn't need a political attribution. And then another argument against attribution in the context of the initiative was that the ransomware groups today have such a complex architecture, especially those ransomware as a service providers that we see, that you can't just hold one country accountable for that. The arguments of the pro fraction, like myself, of course, as a diplomat, is that holding states accountable also for the ransomware activities going on from their territory is actually strengthening the norms framework. And we have several norms that can be applied here, like the due diligence norm, that a government is responsible to restrict and reduce malicious activities emanating from its territory. And the second one is that we have to put more pressure on those uncooperative jurisdictions and have to use all tools at our hands.
Thank you so much, Regine. So, any questions here? Sure.
I guess just one to follow up on the capacity building aspects. I know that's in the diplomacy group and it's in your group as well. Other than the project you're doing with us, what other plans do you have? There's a lot of countries who are not part of the ransomware task force, who are trying to develop capabilities in this area. How do you plan to take that forward? And all of you are members of the GFC, so we're happy about that.
That's fantastic. So I'll shape that into a question for Regine, which is, it really is a broad group of countries participating, the Dominican Republic, Nigeria, South Africa. We talked about the number of Asian countries. And as Regine mentioned, she has a new co-lead of the diplomacy panel, and our intent is really to focus on expansion of countries in the global south, rather than the more traditional partners one might expect. And that's intentional because there was a sense that that's where capacity building, either in implementing Know Your Customer frameworks and countering illicit crypto, or in using the malware Kush repository that India has brought to bear, or the Regional Cyber Defense Center in Lithuania, the Lithuanians have offered to bear to produce joint products. So Regine, maybe you can talk about kind of key next steps on outreach to the countries we want to bring in with intentionality for those who really need to be and build more capacity.
It's not only that we see that capacity is needed there in terms of we need partners for our practitioners who want to work with these countries, and the two ends have to meet, so we have to build capacities there. It's also that the global south countries have an increased sense of urgency that they have to do something about it, because cybercrime is erupting everywhere where digital transformation creates benefits and profits. So the steep increase in the numbers of ransomware attacks that we see is an immediate consequence of the digital progress that many countries are making. And the digital diplomacy track will have a look at who is, let's say, in the target zone, or who is vulnerable in the sense of providing new attack surface to those criminal organizations and would benefit from our cooperation.
So I want to end our panel, first, of course, with a thank you to all the 5 panel co-leads who did the bulk of the work. As you can imagine, when you have a global cooperation like this, the timeframes of our sync-ups was always difficult. For some of us, it was 5:30 in the morning. For others, it was very late in the evening. But I want to end with a call to action in terms of where we need to go. For technology companies to build in security by design to make their products less vulnerable, less easy to hack. And certainly, as governments, a number of us governments have started to move to put in place requirements for any tech that we buy to meet certain software supply chain and other standards. For operators of critical infrastructure, owners and operators, certainly vast improvements in resilience are dramatically needed. Microsoft is a key company participating in the Paris Peace Call. They recently released a report that highlighted the degree of unpatched systems that are consistently compromised. So a call to truly improve resilience to make it far harder for attackers. Cryptocurrency infrastructure, a call to implement Know Your Customer rules. And certainly for governments, both those participating and those we invite to participate. It's a transnational problem. Criminals, infrastructure, vulnerable victims, that takes international partnership to make progress. It's truly been an honor for us countries working together. I mentioned that at the 2-day summit, we invited in 13 international companies to give their perspective on how governments can do better, on how the private sector can do better, and the most important question, how we can do better together, and we look to expand that as well. So a thank you to those who are here in person, those who are here virtually from India, Australia, and the UK. And we look forward to accomplishing far more together. You heard about some of those deliverables in year 2. Thank you.
you.